Thanks again for everyone who's joining us and getting on right now. We're seeing a good turnout. I want to give everyone just about another 30 seconds to jump on, and then we'll kick it off. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar co-hosted by Local Progress and the Center for Popular Democracy, using your local budget to ensure a fair count in 2020 for the US Census. Local Progress is a national network of progressive elected officials from cities, counties, towns, school districts, villages, and other local governments across the country. Our members are committed to reclaiming the power that cities and counties have in advancing our shared vision of economic prosperity, equal justice under law, livable and sustainable communities, and good government that serves the public interest. The Center for Popular Democracy works to create equity, opportunity, and a dynamic democracy in partnership with high-impact base-building organizations, organizing alliances, and progressive unions. CPD strengthens our collective capacity to envision and win an innovative, pro-worker, pro-immigrant, racial, and economic justice agenda. This is our first census-related content or programming in a series that we hope to build out in the coming months to support local leaders in ensuring a complete and fair count. It's important to state right now at the outset that the advocacy toolkit we're releasing today is in specific response to Local Progress members who asked about calculating what it would take to locally fund outreach to help support a complete count for their communities. Therefore, a majority of today's presentation will be narrowly focused on local budgets and the importance of allocating local dollars to fund these outreach efforts. We want to make sure that we're counting our hard-to-count communities. We know that there are numerous areas of concern and interest with the 2020 census, and some got flagged today in the registration for the webinar. And we consider this one of many important steps that we can take to support your work. And we're eager to hear from you during the question and answer section about what else you're thinking about and how we can support your needs moving forward. For today's agenda, we're going to start with some context and framing from Emma Greenman, who is the Director of Voting Rights and Democracy at the Center for Popular Democracy. Next, we'll welcome Councilmember Erica Spell from Hyattsville, Maryland, and Vice Mayor Sabrina Javellana, from Hallandale, Florida, who will share why they believe a complete count is so important, along with local highlights for their work. Then Kate Hamaji, who is a research analyst at CPD, will introduce our new toolkit and a budget tool, and we'll leave time for Q&A at the end. A quick housekeeping note that if you're joining only on the phone, you'll need to submit your questions via email to me at tdunlop@populardemocracy.org, or you can text me at 413-822-1051. Those on the computer can raise their hands during the question and answer section, or you can type in the chat box at any time. Finally, we will be recording this as a resource for others to utilize in the coming weeks and months. So just so you're all aware of that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Emma.
Great, thanks, Tarsi. And thank you all for joining us today. I wanted to just start by talking about and framing why the conversation we're having is so important right now, and why I think, particularly at this moment, talking about the role that local electeds can play is so critical. So off for the slide. We all know, I think we're on this webinar because we know that the census is an incredibly important piece of our democracy and a tool for healthy representative democracy and ensuring that everybody in the country and in your city and county and township is counted is critical. I just to note a few things that matters right now. There's uncertainty around the federal budget. It's pretty certain, and we'll talk about a few of the context, but there's uncertainty around the federal budget. There's uncertainty around, in this environment, politicized environment, anti-immigrant environment happening at the federal level. And there is some active attempts to weaponize the census. And so thinking now strategically about all the ways that local electeds can really represent their communities and get their communities counted is really critical. So I'm glad we're talking about this now. We are focusing on the budget piece, but hope and are excited to have some conversation today about the other tools and information sharing and strategies that folks want to build out together as we move forward towards 2020. Take a slide. So just to many of you are already engaged in census work, but the three sort of biggest pieces that are at stake in the census are representation, political representation at every level of government, city, state, federal, will be influenced by and directed by the legislative bodies, by the census count. Resources, funding for local communities, and all the ways, federal funding is allocated to cities, counties, and at the federal level, as well as some indirect implications of census data as well. And then the third piece is the research that informs your policymaking, informs federal policymaking, business decisions, academic decisions, and all of the other ways that census data is really critical for decisions that are made. I'll take the next slide. So the challenge to a fair count, as a reoccurring challenge, is the undercounting of specific communities, labeled hard to count communities that statistically and also numerically are undercounted and thus underrepresented in the census. It has it has negative implications for our communities, for local government, for political representation, and for resources, and is not great for our democracy. And some of the reasons that folks are undercounted, some of the traditional reasons: language barriers, physical barriers, housing arrangements, and sort of things, housing that makes it hard to either reach people or makes it more likely that folks will get undercounted or missed, and then just a historical relationship to government. There are a few things, next slide please, that make this 2020 census all the more tricky and also more important that we're having an all-hands-on-deck moment. Insufficient federal funding to the tune of $2 or $3 billion less than we need just to conduct all the operations in the field for the 2020 census. So there's insufficient federal funding. This will also be the first census, online census, and so there's a shift, and this happened. The plan to shift this happened started during the Obama administration, where we're going to move to an online census, less enumerators in the field, and folks won't. Only 20% of people will get a mailed back questionnaire. But that also means, and one of the other ways that insufficient funding plays into this, is there's just been less testing than was both planned and necessary, because the insufficiency of funding over the last decade leading up to the 2020 census in the last couple of years have also meant that we just know less about how this is going to go. And then there's the citizenship question. Many of you probably are deep into understanding how this is playing out. But there was a proposed, Wilbur Ross proposed putting the citizenship question in the questionnaire. It was challenged. It was heard in front of the Supreme Court, and we expect a ruling in June about whether the citizenship question will stay on or whether the courts will remove it. But that has created there's both the research of the impact it would have just in general in any environment, in terms of mixed status families and immigrant families increasing their non-response rate. But particularly in this politicized climate where we have an administration that has made active attacks on immigrant communities and sort of a rhetoric, a hostile rhetoric, all the more concerning. And then there's a more general mistrust in government that's happening. One, trust in government's at historic lows, in addition to some of the Russian hacking and sort of fears of data security, and sort of that happening at the same time we're moving to an online census just raises additional concerns that we haven't really had to deal with in the past. And so really thinking about this moment critically and looking at all the tools that we have in our toolbox to engage. Next slide. So this is an all hands on deck moment. And I say that to say, I think that there's lots of every census, there's a ton of engagement at the state and local level. I think this is a moment where our affiliates, space building organizations, community organizations are having a conversation about how they need to engage in a different way this time. I think that with local electeds, with state electeds, with federal electeds, with grassroots and grassroots leaders, there's a real moment of this year we all have, or this time we all have to be all in. And I think that as we've been thinking about it and having conversations with local elected members and with elected members in general, there's really three rough ways that you all can exercise your power to ensure your jurisdiction is counted. The power of the purse and budget allocation, and that's what we're going to focus on today, is really preparing and arming you with the resources you need to figure out how your cities and counties and townships and jurisdictions can allocate resources to ensure that your communities are counted. There's also the bully pulpit, so the role you all play, both advocating in the pieces at the federal level as well as at the state and local level. And then there's the trusted community leader role. And I think I know a piece of the conversation that we're going to continue having together that we've been having with our affiliates is how to prepare for the census in this heightened moment and in a place where there are people who want to weaponize the census as a way to really divide and hurt communities. And so how do we channel and really create plans together to ensure that the census we get an accurate census count and everybody is included and everybody feels like they can participate and feel safe. And so that's sort of the three buckets. I think I am going to turn it over, but I want to just add another plug that one of the things, as we've been talking to the local progress team, is like I think we really see like between now and December as the sort of ramp up, gear up moments where we can support your work and in these three different areas. We're going to focus on the budget pieces today, but would love to talk to you about how we can help on all of the other pieces as a co-conspirator and support.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emma. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Councilmember Erica Spell, Hyattsville, Maryland. Erica?
Yes, thank you so much. Again, I want to thank you all for highlighting this really important work. And I want to thank you, Tarts, for your leadership, everyone at Local Progress, and of course the team at Center for Popular Democracy. Is really wonderful. So I just want to take a little bit of time to tell you a little bit about my involvement in preparing for the 2020 census, and also what we're doing in Hyattsville, Maryland, on this as well. So, you know, the first thing is sort of to tie into the previous speaker's work is, you know, I have been invested in this work on a very kind of personal level as just Erica Spell, and then another perspective, of course, as an elected official. And I think that's important for me to say, because I think we all have to have, as elected officials, our own personal story of why it's important, and to share that. And for me personally, that begins with my family and family history. You know, my family, we lost the kind of the matriarch of my family about 5 years ago, my grandmother, who was orphaned by the time she was around 17 years old. And we really looked through the census data as a family as we began to sort of highlight and pull historical information from our family tree. And so I was very connected to this before we even just started to think about how important this information as an elected official, and looking at how this ties into ensuring that we have appropriate resources, that we know exactly who is made up, who makes up our communities that we serve. But each person has, it can sort of link their own individual experiences as to why this information is important. As the previous speaker mentioned, there are the historical data, and of course, if you follow the work of Dr. Henry Louis Gates, you also know that that is a critical piece into building the African American story in this country as well, how looking towards the census data has been able to bridge that gap in history. But again, just focusing here as an elected official in the Hyattsville experience, it's no secret that, and perhaps some of you who aren't familiar with the city of Hyattsville, Maryland, we are a sanctuary city, and we are one of few cities in the United States who does have non-citizen voting in our municipal elections. So we understand, and sort of this is familiar territory in the sense that there are some hesitations from our immigrant community about what it means to participate in a process like this. So we have sort of taken the experience that we had in advocating for the non-citizen voting and reassuring folks that this was an opportunity to, in fact, be able to further participate in our local democracy. And so we have learned from that experience, and that we are ensuring that, you know, through this process of advocating and ensuring a complete count, that we are assured to have folks on our committees through, and also through our communication strategies that are bilingual, of course, and that are relying on organizations, community-based organizations who already have sort of the grassroots expertise to reach these hard-to-reach communities. So in Hyattsville, we passed a complete count committee legislation, and we're happy to share that with you, establishing this committee and making sure that the committee itself is made up of folks who represent all corners of our municipality. But also, you know, what's really important in the work that this committee will do is mapping out those places that are going to be, that we have deemed as hard to reach. As the speaker mentioned earlier, those where there are multi-unit buildings, and also where we have mapped out where we have a higher concentration of non-citizens. And so we, the sort of implementation and communication strategy around that is going to be really important for this complete count committee. And there were funds that were designated towards supporting the work of that committee. In addition to that, you know, we also sort of took a look at, obviously this is all sort of happening. We just approved our 2020 budget last night. So we also made sure that there were resources within existing departments, specifically our Department of Community Service, to allocate towards funding, again, around a larger implementation effort and communications. And then also to think, if you want to think a little bit more creatively about how to fund these types of efforts. Another thing we also looked at is, because of course, as municipalities, we can be pushed for financial resources, and we've been able to sort of bridge that gap in two ways. One, also look at kind of the short-term contracts of having additional personnel, and also relying on the expertise, again, of community-based organizations who already are very familiar with our communities, who are very, very familiar with what it takes to do grassroots outreach in the community. So I just sort of wanted to, for those of you who might be calling and wondering how you're going to be able to fund these efforts, I just wanted to make sure that you were aware that that was another way to achieve these goals as well. So I look forward to the rest of the conversation, and thanks again for providing me an opportunity to talk a little bit about what we're doing here in Hyattsville, Maryland.
Thank you so much, Erica. That was really helpful and comprehensive, and I know that at least a couple of us on the local progress staff are already eager to talk to you more about specifics and make sure that we're sharing out the information. And I think this recording is a great start to being able to capture some of the good work that's already happening as an example. So if you are able to stay on, I know you had some time challenges this afternoon, so I really appreciate your being able to be on. And if you're able to stay on for the rest of the webinar to answer some questions, that would be great. If not, we can make sure to field them to you afterwards.
Thank you so much.
With that, I would like to turn it over to Vice Mayor Sabrina Javellana from Hallandale, Florida. Sabrina, thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to be able to have you talk about the work that you're doing. Please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. So my name is Sabrina Javellana, and I live in Hallandale, which is a we actually just changed our name a couple years ago to Hallandale Beach. So we're a coastal community. It's really small, 4 square miles. And you have like your really fancy high rises on the beach, and then you have your kind of blighted areas towards the west side of more like single family homes. So you have a lot of diversity in this really small city that's surrounded everywhere. And I'm really glad you brought it up, Erica, about your city being a sanctuary city and having that status, which is amazing. And unfortunately in my city of Florida, in my state of Florida, the legislation was just passed and is about to be signed by the governor that's going to ban all sanctuary cities and kind of force like local cities and counties to have their local departments, police departments, work as ICE agents, which is kind of going to harm the already tense relationships that our law enforcement has with immigrant communities. So, we're already starting off on a rough foot here in Florida. But now that we're starting in 2019, about a whole year before the census starts, is really crucial. So what I've focused the most, that I've brought up to my fellow commissioners and my city manager in the last couple months since January, is that we should be forming a census complete count committee, like a lot of cities, counties nationally are doing. And I kind of got the idea when I learned more about this when I went to a local progress training in December. And also my county officials have been putting together a local complete count committee and working closely with our Congresswoman, Debbie Wasserman Schultz. So it's kind of like a federal, county, citywide, collaborative effort. We haven't really had much really collaboration with the state level yet, but hopefully that comes soon. But so far, we have really great partners, and we're partnering with local organizations that we have in our state, like Florida Immigrant Coalition, the New Florida Majority, that are going to kind of be helping us with identifying people who don't usually get targeted. When people go canvassing, they don't normally go to those people first. So some of the things we've done in the city of Hallandale Beach is we formed our complete count committee, which is going to kind of serve as like the advisory boards we have in our city, like parks and recreation, sustainability, unsafe structures, where local residents or business owners or even elected officials or city staff can serve on these boards. And in my city, we don't have like an abundance of boards where it's like one for every issue, and then like there's not really great participation and outcome of it. We have it condensed, and so residents feel like it's very honorable to serve on these boards, to be involved in their community. And we're making this complete count committee very inclusive. We have safe neighborhood taxing districts in the city, 2 of them. So we're asking for a representative from each of those safe neighborhood taxing districts because they know their areas the most, since they work with their neighbors every day. And we're also asking for under 18 representatives from our local high school. We have 1 in the city, and collaboration with the school board of Broward County, where my city is, and also different language speaking representatives. So it's kind of like, take a look back, step back from your city and look at what kind of communities you have. In my city specifically, we know we have Russians, we have large Spanish-speaking populations, Colombians and Venezuelans, and we have large Caribbean populations, mostly speaking Creole, coming from Haiti. So we said, okay, we need to have people on deck who can translate for us in Spanish, in Creole, and in Russian. And from prior city experiences, such as when we had a hurricane last year, we have these contacts in our city. We have city staff members who can translate in Spanish. We have city volunteers who can translate in Russian. So it's kind of like identifying those people early is really important because we know there's going to be language barriers. And as a really diverse city where you have, really condensed areas in the 4 quadrants of my city, you can tell this area is primarily Hispanic. This area is prominently African American and Caribbean. The beach is primarily mostly white, Russians, Ukrainians. So you kind of, those areas, and the specific language needs that they're going to have. So that's really important to us. And so the biggest thing is participation. We know people aren't, usually excited to fill out their census form, or even, because people aren't it's the same thing with voting. You have to motivate people to kind of vote, to get out the vote. So we're getting out the census count. And we're working with our faith communities. We're getting them on board. We have numerous churches, mosques, and synagogues in the city. So kind of starting those relationships really early on with kind of the leaders and organizers in those places of faith, to kind of see who's the contact person who can have information displayed in the church about the census, have a computer where they can fill it out. And also, like I said, we're working with the school board because it's really difficult, to just get into schools and talk to the high school students or the middle school students, you and your family should fill out the census. And then the kids don't really take it home. So we're trying to work so as soon as January 2020 comes around, when the parent-teacher conferences come around, and there's PTA, PTSA nights, having members of the Complete Count Committee there and present, talking about everything we talked about before, why it's so important, what do the cities and counties and districts get from, accurate and high census counts, and seeing if they could fill it out then, or pass it on to their fellow PTA members. So we're also creating opportunities for members of our community to be able to fill out the census online, because we know Wi-Fi and computer access are really significant barriers for, middle and low income class people. So in City Hall, we are designating in the very kind of open area as soon as you come in, a computer lab. Well, a few different computers where people can come in and fill out the census. And if they have any questions, we're going to have a staff member from Human Resources to be dedicated to be the census designate person. So if anyone has any questions while they're filling it out, they can, talk to that person right there and have some help. Also in our community parks that we have that have indoor facilities and have computers, we're going to waive any fees involved or any membership involved for people who are coming to take the census. So making a computer and Wi-Fi really accessible to people is really important to us. And like I said, we're partnering with a lot of different organizations, such as places of worship, the faith communities, the Broward County School Board, our County Complete Count Committee, our congressional delegation, to kind of do some education. But we are also working with our Chamber of Commerce, our Rotary Club, our Kiwanis Club in the city of Hallandale, that have relationships with our local business owners who can, promote the census within the city. And then same thing on the last thing we're doing really for promotion is having a really active social media campaign. Something my city has done in the past to kind of let our residents know about any upcoming really important events or information they need to know is we put the info on their monthly water bill. So because most people who get their water bill who aren't part of a homeowners or a condo association, they see that right there. So that's a good place we've been putting information, and we'll be putting that out there once January 2020 comes out. And I think that's it. Yeah, so that's just a few of the things we're trying to work on in Hallandale Beach.
Thanks so much, Sabrina. And I think one of the things that you're really sort of bringing up and indicating in your examples, and Erica as well, is how there is so much local work happening, and so many elected officials and community groups are trying to figure out how to connect and how to create access and opportunity to fill out the census, especially when people may not have access to computers. And I think that we're also, as we think about how we're trying to make up for the lost funding, there are a lot of creative ideas happening that some people are having to do without funding, but a lot of these things are really important to invest in and to make sure that people who are volunteering their time might have an opportunity to actually earn a little bit of money to be able to do the work to help support Get Out the Count. So what we've done is we've done some calculations as part of this toolkit to help invest in local work that's happening that electeds are trying to support. And we really encourage folks to think about what's happening and what they could help increase by virtue of local investment. So with that, I would like to take several minutes to turn it over to Kate Hamaji, who is our WIS research analyst and has been a total rock star in helping put this toolkit together over the past few weeks along with Emma. And it really is to provide some concrete tools about how you can make the case to allocate resources in your jurisdiction, and we'll walk through how to estimate how much to put into your budget. Kate?
Great. Thank you so much, Tarsi. I'm going to just share my screen right now. Give me just one moment here. Can folks on the computer see this? Yes. Okay. Great. So like Tarsi said, I'm going to spend my time talking a little bit about how you can really use your local power as elected officials, specifically leveraging your local budget to make sure that the communities in your local jurisdiction are counted. And so there are two pieces of this. One is making the case for why this is important. So this is thinking about actually quantifying what the financial losses would be to local residents in your community as an advocacy tool, as a talking point, so that you can educate your colleagues, the general public, members of the community about why it's so important to be doing this work. And then the second is actually, like Tarsi said, doing a calculation to determine what specific amount of funding you would need to advocate for, to put in your local budget to support some of this complete count, get out the count work in your jurisdiction. So this is an overview of the first calculation that we're going to walk through. I will break it down. It can look a little overwhelming if you're just looking at it for the first time, but it's actually a very basic calculation. It is trying to determine for your local jurisdiction what the funding loss is to residents in your community. It's using the hard to count population in your community and data about estimated annual funding that a resident in your community would lose due to an undercount. So there are, I think probably a lot of you have heard this figure, $800 billion in federal funding that goes to states every year based on census data. One piece of context that's helpful to understand is that when we're talking about federal resources flowing to your local residents in your local community, this is not necessarily all money that goes to, like, funnels directly through local budgets, right? It's often state funding that then has some local budget implications. But we know for sure that when there's undercounts in your community, that impacts directly state budgets, right? And has, like I said, very direct implications on local funding and the kinds of things that local jurisdictions are then forced to kind of compensate for or accommodate. So that is just an important thing to know as we walk through this. Okay, so the first step in trying to figure out what your loss is in this attempt to make the case is to determine the percentage of residents that are hard to count in your jurisdiction. So I'm going to walk you through first a county example and then a city example. For counties, you're going to use this tool that CUNY has put together. They're hard to count maps, and if you can follow this hyperlink, which is in the toolkit, you'll come to a web page that looks like this. The CUNY tool allows you to search by both state and county, so you'll want to make sure that you're searching by county, and you simply type in the county that you're interested in. I chose King County because I live in Seattle, so we'll take a take a biased facilitator's choice here. And then you have the census self-response rate on the left-hand side of the screen. So when we populate King County, we see that in 2010, 79.3% of the county's households mailed back their 2010 census questionnaire. So that means that the inverse of that, the 20.7% of residents in King County did not and are considered hard to reach, right? So they would require some intensive and costly follow-up to make sure that all of those folks are counted. The next thing that we would do then is we need to find out what the local jurisdiction's total population is in order to figure out what subset of that is considered hard to count. So this is an easy thing to do. You just go to the ACS, American Community Survey Fact Finder website. It's also hyperlinked. And you type in your county. We have King County. We're using the 5-year 2017 estimate. And it gives us a population of about 2.1 million people. So that's the total county population. Next thing you do is very simple. You just take the county population and multiply it by your hard to count rate to get the hard to count population. So we're looking at 438,000 about people in King County that are hard to count. Okay. Next, we are going to think about what the kind of median amount of local funding, the median amount of money is lost to residents each year, and think about that in relation to your hard to count population. So we have this figure, $1,091. It was put together by the George Washington Institute in Public Policy, I think is the name. So it's kind of an established figure. An important thing to note here is that we actually are only able to estimate about 48% of federal funding that goes to states. So this calculation is extremely conservative, and that's an important thing to say when you're messaging this number to folks. It just is kind of like a way to start quantifying how huge this impact is, although it's a conservative number and it would be much greater because we only know how to account for a portion of it. So you're going to take your hard to count population and you're multiplying it by that figure, that $1,091. In King County, that tells us that there are $478.3 million that would be lost to residents each year if that 20.7% of folks were to be missed. And so, that's a pretty staggering number. And if you think about it, over the course of 10 years, we were talking about an even greater figure. I think this is, $4.78 billion over the course of 10 years, right? So this is like the advocacy number. This is the number that you use to kind of show people like, wow, we're really talking about something pretty substantial here. And so it's very important for us to be putting money in our budget to reach these folks. Okay, so that takes us to calculation 2. So you found the you're kind of demonstrating the impact, you're making the case, and now you can actually determine how much funding you would need to put in your budget to do the work. So when we're talking about this calculation, I just want to give some background about the type of outreach we are talking about. So this is a model that Census Counts 2020, which is a group of policy and research organizations, put together to look at the kind of resources that are needed to reach hard-to-count populations with community-based organizations. So as Erica was describing, community-based organizations are really critical messengers and validators. They have the inside knowledge of hard-to-count communities. They have often the trust of community members. So this model really focuses on funding that would be needed to have those types of organizations do the work directly. The model thinks about 3 levels of outreach: basic, moderate, and intensive. And what that means is basic outreach is essentially just a number of public forums, basic information to folks who come through the doors of these community-based organizations, and some level of direct outreach. But everybody in the hard-to-count population should receive this kind of outreach, and the estimated dollar amount that it would cost is $2 per person. Excuse me. The moderate outreach includes the same public forums and broad outreach that basic covers, but in addition, there's some in-person discussions with people in hard-to-count communities and some more one-on-one contact. The model estimates that 10% of the hard-to-count community should receive moderate outreach. The cost is $25 a person. And then for intensive outreach, this is really like much more targeted outreach to through like intensive longer sessions with people. It includes things like outreach in languages other than English, outreach to folks who are homeless, or people who don't have access to the internet or have computers at home. It's estimated that about 5% of the hard-to-count population needs this outreach, and the cost is $75 per person. So these are just like the assumptions that we're working with as I walk you through the calculation that follows. Okay, so step 1 in determining what amount of funding you need to put in your budget. This looks very similar to step 1 of our last calculation, right? We want to figure out how many residents are hard to count in your jurisdiction. We're going to do an example for a city since we did county for the last one. For cities, you're going to follow this link. It will take you to this Census webpage that lays out census participation rates. And so one difference between the census participation rates and the CUNY maps is that the census participation rate is a slightly cruder estimate because it doesn't account for households that are determined to be vacant, whereas the county level estimates do. And we're using this only because cities are not available on the CUNY website. For purposes of like an estimation of resources needed, this should work just fine, but that's why we're using different sources. So if you go to the census website for a city, it'll lead you through a number of links where you can pull up an Excel sheet that has a list of every city in the country. And let's say Tempe is our example here. So I have highlighted it here. This first column is the 2000 rate. The second is the 2010 rate. So if we're looking at the participation rate of folks in Tempe in 2010, we have 0.7, or 70% of folks who participated. Then we take the inverse of that. That means that 30% of folks did not participate. So that's our hard to count population for the city. Okay, next, again, we're going back to our census ACS fact finder to find the total population. Again, that's simply following the link, typing in your city, pulling up the population. For Tempe, it's 178,339 people. Then we are finding our hard to count population. So again, this is the same as before. You're just taking the total population for the city, applying the hard to count percentage to that population to get your hard to count number. So in Tempe, we have a hard to count population of about 53,500 people. Okay, now this is the fun part. So now we are just taking our levels of outreach and we are doing some multiplication. So we have our 53,500 hard to count folks who should each be getting basic outreach, $2 a person. You multiply that and you get a number. Then you do your moderate outreach. You take your total hard to count population. That 10% of that population gets $25 worth of moderate outreach. That's another simple calculation. And then for intensive, it's 5% of the hard to count population at $75 a person. You get another number for that level. Okay, I'm not going to name all the numbers because it will just be a mouthful, and you can look at it afterwards if you need more details. And then finally, you just add those 3 levels of outreach together, right? So basic, moderate, and intensive. In the case of Tempe, we get $441,000, almost $400. So this is the number you care about. This is the amount of funding that Tempe would need to put in the local budget for CBO outreach based on this established model. So I will say that this looks a lot hairier than it really is to do. Like once you're familiar with the the CUNY maps and the census participation website, it's a pretty straightforward thing to pull up and do by hand. If you want to do this for your city and are getting stuck, please feel free to reach out to us. We can walk you through it or even do it for you. And what is even more exciting is we are starting to develop a tool, which I'm going to preview, and a really talented colleague of mine, Tam, I don't know if she's on the phone right now, helped us put together. So what this is basically a calculator. The Census 2020, the ones that developed this methodology, they already have a state tool that does this for you, but we're adapting this so that you're able to look at a number of local jurisdictions. So this is not a comprehensive list of every city in the country, but it's sort of a sampling of states just to show you what this could do. So let's say we're interested in New York City. You can pull it up in this drop-down menu, and it will show you your total population, your 2010 non-participation rate, derive your hard-to-count population rate based on those 2 fields, and then show you at each level of outreach what the cost would be and what the total cost is. So we can send this around to folks. You can see if your city's on it if you want to use it. If you're not and you want your city added, or if you want to do the calculation with support from us, let us know, and we're going to be building this out in the future. Okay, I will stop there and turn it back over to Tarsi.
Thanks so much, Kate. That's an incredible tool, and we really appreciate the local progress members who originally sort of said, we're trying to think about how much money we might need to allocate to help fund, and we have no idea really what we're looking at. So that was the sort of challenge posed to us, and we put our heads together and started building this tool, and it's obviously going to keep growing, and we're really excited about it. And Kate, thanks so much for your leadership in pulling all of that together. I think right now we're ready to turn it over for 10 minutes of Q&A, and we have some questions that we would like to ask you if folks don't have any, but let's take some time and open it up. As a reminder, you can put questions in the chat box or raise your hand if you're on the computer and we can unmute you. If you're on the phone, you need to text your question or email it to me. And I might turn it over to Sylvia to see if we have some questions.
I'll just encourage people to not be shy. Feel free to raise your hands. You can do that easy. Let me read the first question I see, and this is coming from Lucy. How do you determine the cost in your jurisdiction if your jurisdiction is not a city or county? I'm on the board of a community college and our boundaries don't correspond with city or county limits.
That is an excellent question that I would have to pull in someone with a little bit more data prowess than me to answer. I think the participation rates that I've found for I think the smallest, there are some towns, but I haven't seen rates available for things like school districts. I believe that there may be some like census tract level data available, and I don't know if there's ways to kind of manipulate that to do smaller estimations, but we will, I think some of these technical questions that we might need more like data expertise to answer, we should just be tracking. And there's somebody that I've been in touch with at CUNY who might be able to help us figure that out.
Great, thank you. Let me jump in here with a second question. This is coming from Chris Roberts from Shoreline. Does the calculator account for regional variation on costs?
No, it doesn't. That's a great question. This is just like a straight breakdown based on the Census Counts 2020 methodology for states, which also did not account for regional variation in costs. You can modify, of course, the calculation if you feel like these estimates are too high or too low. And you could do that in the tool itself too, but as it is now, it does not.
Kate, a quick follow-up question. This one's coming directly from me. Those costs, I assume that's intended to consider like canvasser costs. Do you know at all sort of what went into figuring those numbers?
Mm-hmm. So basically the overview, I'm sure there is a more kind of calculated set of assumptions for what those levels are. What I don't have a deeper understanding of like what those costs are beyond kind of what I read in the methodological notes of the Census Counts 2020 tool. So I would probably direct people to those folks or help connect to try to understand better how those things were determined.
Okay, great, thank you. A couple of more questions coming in. I'm sorry, Emma, were you about to jump in?
No, I was just going to say, and I think just sort of to put this in perspective is, I think that the reality, and particularly the reality with where funding at the state and federal level is that I think it's great to do a regional variation, and I think it's great to think about to have an estimate. I think the reality is that as much money as you can allocate, like, will be necessary to fill some of the holes. And so thinking about being able to really advocate for the money you need, but given where the state and the federal government are at right now, like the need will be bigger than any funding allocation. So just to put that in perspective in terms of the estimates.
Great, thank you so much. I see another question here. Where did I see this? Okay. Can you guys speak to the time frame in which the census actually begins, and how much prep time we have in the lead up to that? And then a second question, similar, well, not similar, is whether there's any data of any age-based undercounting.
So I can take the sort of main census operation starts, the gear up as they call it, in January of 2020. The goal is, and this is sort of an easy answer and a hard one, the goal is that everybody is counted on April 1st, National Census Day. And so there's a huge effort around that in terms of when people are contacted. The reality, both in some hard to count places, states and regional folks where they have a harder count like Alaska, it starts earlier. There's also in a lot of places an earlier start for college areas because of the schedule. And so there's a sort of a very basic timeline and then some very specific timelines, both of which we can get you. But the real action in most places happens really to gear up to make sure that the self-reporting happens in that spring and that the whole thing is done by July of 2020. And so now, there's a ton, and as talked about both the two electeds on the call and many of you, there's been a ton of organizing happening. And really the goal is to be ready for January and February to sort of have all of those plans. I think that the calendar for the budget allocation we wanted to get on, and one of the questions we have for you all is, given how budget cycles work, what are the opportunities to both do it now and think about emergency funding or other sort of supplementary funding, given that there's still some uncertainties with state and federal budgets. So I think that's a longer answer than you asked for.
But very detailed. I like it. I'm going to ask, I see a question here. Somebody's wondering if specifically senior citizens are fully counted.
Yeah, so, and this goes back to the last question too, which I think I missed, which is on the under 5. So there's some very specific, I don't think that senior citizens as a population demographic are one of the harder to count communities. That doesn't account for the fact that senior citizens are in communities of color, obviously, they're in low income communities, they're in transit communities. But I just sort of more generally in terms of a resource point, there are a set of national organizations that are hubs for different hard to count communities. So specifically the under 5 and the kids count that we can send around more information on and sort of more, they have a bunch of fact sheets, and there's a census counts website as well that we can just send around for some of the basic information on hard to count communities and who's sort of heading those up nationally.
Great. I have 2 more questions. We have 3 minutes, so I'm going to try to read these quickly and hopefully we can answer, but then we'll also sit around some answers in written form. So, and maybe Sabrina and Erica, this one's specifically for you, but someone's asking that if we're interested in recruiting community members or staff or others in our community to help promote the census, can somebody speak to the training mechanisms that exist either through the actual census program or through any other mechanisms?
So I want to leave that to, those are the kinds of questions that I think we actually want to do a deep dive in and actually potentially do a whole hour or some sharing both of how the different ways that both the Census Bureau is recruiting and training enumerators and also the way that different communities and community complete count committees are doing that. So that's sort of a punt, but I think that's a really important question about both the recruitment and the training that I think we want to spend more time with in probably the late spring, early summer, or early summer, I guess, where we are now.
Great. Thank you so much. Sabrina, I'm going to call on you, and then I do see the question from you, Bo, so you'll be the last question.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to mention the National Association of Latino Elected Officials came to Broward County, and so that's kind of where we started our county-wide complete count committee organizing to figure out how we're going to form these committees in our cities and who's going to train them. And so they had someone from their staff from the NALEO to come and train everyone on how to form these committees.
Awesome. And Lori, I see your question about the undercount, and we'll follow up with you directly on that. I am conscious of the fact that we have about a minute left, so I want to wrap us up with 2 things. One, as Emma and Kate have both said, there are things in the works. There are particular areas that we want to spend more thoughtful time on. There are coalition tables and a lot of organizations who are spending time thinking about this and trying to gather information and put together resources. We're really excited to be in partnership with them. One of our speakers texted that there are some philanthropic organizations like Forefront in Illinois and the Philanthropic Network in New York who are doing funding. So please take a look and see what those options are. We'd like to keep working with you, so think about what you need in terms of relationship, expertise, or tools, and let us know. We want to know what's going on or going well in your get out the count efforts, and places of concern and gaps that you may be seeing. So please think about all of those things. And then I want to quickly, I'll flip to this page, and Sylvia, if you want to ask the last question, I apologize, Bo, that I jumped ahead there.
Thank you so much. I think Bo raises an interesting question. We're often thinking about big cities, but Bo notes that the hard to count rates are based off of the return rates from the 2010 form mailed back. And so wondering if if we can expect their return rates might be even lower this time, and if there's anything we can do to address that. Given that some more rural areas might have less broadband access, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really good point, and I think it would make sense to assume that the hard to count rates would be even worse in 2020. I don't. It'd be interesting to talk through how we might adjust for that in the actual funding estimate itself. I mean, I think you could certainly say that this is a conservative amount, of dollars needed based on the 2020 experience, and we would probably need more. But yeah, it's a good point to try to think through like what that extra dollar figure might actually come out to. I don't know.
Yeah, and I would just say too, there is some jurisdictions that have been identified as like places with low digital infrastructure, and that they will get the mailed questionnaire as well. But I think just in general, the issues, the sort of 2020 issues, which is the broadband issues and sort of what it looks like to have an online census, as well as the citizenship question issues and the mistrust in government issues, I think it is a fair and conservative assumption to say that the undercount rates are likely to be higher starting. And so this is I would like to leave it with an all hands on deck moment of like using every tool in your toolbox of, city and county and jurisdictional budgets, advocating that your states do the same, making sure that we have a voice at the federal level, getting Congress to do what they need to do, and then also all of the other work. So that's my plug on all hands on deck.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone. These links will all be going out in the follow-up email. I just put them up here so that you knew some of the other great resources that are going on. Are great resources out there and organizations doing great work, including NALEO that Sabrina mentioned, who came down to do a training. We're really looking forward to continuing to engage in this work moving forward. So please feel free to reach out to us, and I'll probably be reaching out to some of you as well. But on that note, we'd like to thank all of our presenters and panelists and all of you participants for taking your time, and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Bye.
Thanks, Darcy, for facilitating. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.